So I got to talk to you about this playlist that you put together for us. Did you have a sort of a thematic art that you were going for with this, or is this just sort of your greatest hits? Or talk to me a little bit about how you approached it.
I don't know. I always find it really impossible picking tracks, so I just try to think of things that I can talk about, really. But yeah, I mean, I like most people just love a massive variety of lots of different music, and each of these different songs kind of means something for different reasons, or inspired something, or I don't know, opened my eyes to like a different sort of genre or sound or whatever.
This first track, Praise You, Fatboy Slim, obviously, the first thing that pops in my mind is the video.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about like where you were when this track came out. And
this was when I was like a small child, so I just remember hearing this on the radio so much, and then having the album on CD. And it was probably like my dad that had it or something. Like it probably wasn't even like my album, but I just remember the guy on the cover, this sort of like quite large guy, with the sunglasses on, and the whole record just being kind of brilliant. And for my young mind, like not something I'd ever really heard before. It was quite exciting, soulful music, samples, repetitive, you know, like there's a warmth to it. Like it's kind of like dance music. On the record that we've just made, I wanted to nod to that era a little bit in some of the beats and some of the sounds, and try and recreate this sort of like looped but warm kind of drum feeling, and using other people's voices a little bit throughout the record as well, rather than just mine, within the track and within some of the backing vocals, to kind of get that sense of sampling and of like a sort of breadth of sound. I mean, it's probably the first like electronic album that I bought, an interesting but accessible kind of education to that.
You know, you were talking about, you know, the UK having that moment in sort of the early 90s and really just kind of exporting a new sound that a lot of people here, especially in the States, hadn't gotten their hands on. And you're looking at this track from Underworld, then I feel like that's definitely sort of the same class.
Yeah,
you know what
totally.
I mean?
And for me, you know, I remember it being just totally defined by Trainspotting.
Yeah.
And from the trailer through to its moment in the film, through to like its presence on the radio and on the soundtrack and all that kind of stuff, it was like a real gritty British, I think, like film for like kind of era of obviously like Danny Boyle, like amazing. There's something about that era that was kind of like, there's like euphoria there, there's a real darkness underneath it, and there's this sort of emotion and a soul to it. And I wanted to on this album make a record that at times felt like what my and our quite British version of like a party record would be. But like the life that I live, you know, when I'm back home, like most of my friends don't work in entertainment or in music or in anything like that. So like we will have like house parties and stuff, but it's not like popping champagne bottles, and it's not like that. So I wanted to try and create a story of a night out that felt sort of slightly grubby and British and rough around the edges, and have probably quite sanitized, but like such a affectionate memory of this era, which was sort of probably as I was first becoming aware of music. You know, it's the stuff that, but that's the amazing thing. I think that's my like a lot of my musical education came via film soundtracks, because they are so amazing at that. Like it's this curated album that has, you're kind of forcing something that had a totally different context into another one.
Somebody who actually is also dabbling in sort of movie scoring and production work for film and television is Bon Iver, and you've got 22 Over Soon here, and he's sort of just really starting to kind of explore that space.
His latest record, it's just amazing. Like, you know, I think artists who sort of have the courage to potentially throw away structure in their songwriting a bit more, and you know, sonically it's so beautiful. He used this thing called an OP1. That's where a lot of the sort of like high pitched up vocals that are sort of wander in and out come from, and you can literally shake it while you're playing it back and it'll have the same effect as like what shaking a tape deck would do, in terms of the points in the record where it like cuts out and distorts and all that kind of, that's sort of where it comes from. And he used it on a bunch of the tracks as well, which is like really fun. There's a song called 4 a.m. on the album which I like sampled in myself, sort of booing into this keyboard, and then we used that as a keyboard itself and got a lot of the kind of drum sounds from there. So like, you know, it's a kind of nice way to take a record that I absolutely love and that is brilliant. And we recently did a tour with an orchestra and a gospel choir, and John G, who plays the large kind of like bass sax in our live show, I was like definitely inspired by Bon Iver, but sort of got him into the studio to add that texture to our music, which we haven't really had before. So that kind of weaves through the album a little bit as well. And it's, you know, like I'm not someone that would like necessarily sit and listen to like improvisational jazz sax ever, but right. You know, but hearing those moments in the Bon Iver record, they're beautiful. And you know, it sometimes takes an artist that you trust and that you love to do something and bring in other elements of music that they love, and that, you know, that's the window in.
Going back to talking about sort of the golden age of soundtracks in the early 90s, you have the Fugees, obviously, and Killing 'Em Softly, and that album in particular, the score was basically a soundtrack. You know what I mean? It was basically, that was their sophomore album, and it was basically them soundtracking this fictional version of themselves.
I mean, what an amazing album. That, like, for me as a kid, that soundtracked so much of my youth. Both because my sister loved it, and then I kind of got into it as well. And it's just like, it's so beautiful. And I think also when I started writing songs when I was a teenager, I was so obsessed with writing, and I was terrible at it. But my mum and dad or whoever would sort of say like, oh, why don't you play like other songs by other people that you love? And I was like, no, I want to write my own. Like, I maybe felt that there was something like less valid about playing other people's songs, which I've, was rapidly schooled in how ridiculous that is. But like, but Killing Me Softly, realizing that it wasn't their song. I know it sounds really obvious, but it was a real like eye opener for me to kind of realize that. And and then to listen back to the original and hear how they reinterpreted it. But it's so simple, it's so affecting, it's her voice, it's like a really simple beat. And yeah, like you said, it's in this really interesting pioneering way of being like, oh, we're gonna make an album, but we're gonna flip the format and we're gonna make it filled with skits and all this different kind of stuff. But it's like taking the idea of a film and the idea of a soundtrack and using that. And that's something that on our mixtapes, that was the entire point, very much inspired by that.
You talked a little bit earlier about Simon and Garfunkel, and they were, you go look back to Mrs. Robinson and all that stuff in The Graduate, and how they kind of really were one of the first kind of like, this is a soundtrack with licensed music from artists that that you could go see a concert from. Talk to me about The Only Living Boy in New York, how that, out of all of the Simon and Garfunkel catalog, that one in particular stood out to you.
So my parents like used to listen to a lot of Simon and Garfunkel. So for me, it was like childhood car music. But that album, I always thought that Bridge Over Troubled Waters was a greatest hits. It's just so full of, it's kind of really diverse. There's like The Boxer, there's really cinematic string stuff like the song Bridge Over Troubled Waters itself. I was always just really struck with Only Living Boy in New York, with when there's that breakdown bit and it just goes to the sort of the backing vocals, there's sort of almost like choir that comes in, this like falsetto. It's just ridiculously beautiful. There's something about how ethereal the whole track feels. Like, I don't know, it just always stood out to me as my favorite on that record. And that album to me was really important, both because it kind of soundtracks a lot of my childhood, but also it made me realize that records could be really diverse, and it made me want to write records and try write records where every single song was a little bit different to the last, and in and of itself was really memorable and said its own thing and was a little bit of a story.
Looking at this next track, I think J. Paul and that album was a watershed moment. What did that feel like in the UK when that kind of popped off?
Well, I feel like it's one of those songs, and he's one of those artists that like people, like real music lovers, will obviously know exactly who you're talking about, but in the kind of wider world, he's totally unknown. But I feel like the influence he's had on music is just almost incomprehensibly huge. You can just hear the influence. You can hear the influence of his production in everything. I remember like hearing that record is so brilliant and beautiful, and it's kind of filled with these amazing hooks and these ideas, and like, his guitar sound on it now just ripples through like so much pop music and everything, and the harshness with which he would like sidechain his vocals. And there's a part of you listening to it and you're like, can you let me hear your vocal? But then you're like, that's like part of it. It's the whole, listening to that album on headphones for the first time, I was like, you almost feel seasick listening to it. But BTSU, like as a track, I just remember hearing it and being like, I've not heard anything like this before. And it like blew my mind. And every single sound in it, like I think there might even be like saxophone. Is it sax?
Yeah.
At the end of that track?
Yeah.
It's just one melodic line that runs. It's like a riff, it's the verse, it's the chorus, it's everything. The lyrics are fucking cool. I don't think I really know what he's talking about, but it doesn't matter. Like, it's just amazing. And from start to finish, it's like it's a whole world that develops in one, 3-4 minute piece of music. And that's just amazing. And then, we got to hear Jasmine. I think officially that's the only stuff he's ever like released. Which is, I think, to be, and maybe I'm overstating it, but I don't think I am. I think to be that influential to so many different artists across so many different genres, and I've only ever really released one song. Like, I think when he first put it out, it was like 4 or 5 years before anything else. Like, but people still, he managed to retain a sense of mystery, and I don't think there's anyone that people are kind of more readily obsessed with.
Vampire Weekend, obviously, new album coming out, and it's been a minute for them, but you want to talk about artists that obviously owe a great deal to Simon and Garfunkel.
Yeah, Paul Simon, obviously, with that first record.
I mean, they've been very upfront about it. But you look at sort of the standouts from that first record and A-Punk, and talk to me a little bit about why that track off that album in particular.
I mean, it's just impossible to pick a track off that album, and I think I wanted to find something that felt really upbeat. But it was, it's the opening track, it's the first thing most people heard of them. It was like the fluty mellotron sound. Like it for me kind of, I think indie music kind of hit a point in the UK where it just got a bit samey. And to have other artists come in from around the world, like you hear Ezra's voice, you hear, you know, all of the musicians in and of themselves are like unbelievable and have their own style. And I always think about that and the first XX record and Florence's first album was like, here's our sound palette. We're going to put together an album that like just uses this, and every song is going to be standout. Like that's always like, and that's a real important standard set. You know, there are some records that are sprawling and bring in loads of different sonics, particularly nowadays, but like to be a band that it was a 4-piece, it was like pretty basic.
I mean, they don't make them like that.
They
anymore.
don't sound like anyone else.
Right.
And that album still, like, it just jumps out when you hear it. And A-Punk, like, it's just a fucking massive tune. I love it, and it makes me happy. It makes me want to dance. And the idea of bringing like weirder topics and more cerebral kind of oddness into pop music is definitely something that inspired me. You know, our pre-Bastille songs that I used to play by myself were kind of super fucking weird, kind of like odd stories about weird dark shit and whatever. And that was just definitely something that, you know, that came from a lot of people we've already talked about, but I love that in Vampire Weekend.
Before we get into this next one, favorite Kanye album?
I don't know. I really don't know. I think when I was at college, I used to listen to 808s and Heartbreaks like so much. And I know it's not like, with a lot of people who love his music, it's not necessarily the most popular, but I think it was, for a time in my life, it was that record and College Dropout that like I just had on repeat the whole time. I think I will always have a real soft spot for 808s and Heartbreaks because both the sound that it makes, like the sonics of it, and also knowing I don't feel like a lot of the artists that I love that are huge right now would necessarily even be around if it wasn't for that album.
Oh, I mean,
it like
100%.
But as somebody who's such an amazing producer in and of himself, like his ability to, in a sort of classic producer sense, to absorb and appropriate other people's sounds and what's talented in other people and bring that into what he does. And as a kind of like both masterful producer but masterful curator, and reading the stories that emerge afterwards of like producers getting, you know, random emails from him and being like, I want to use this and whatever, and him taking one particular guitar sound from one thing and one snare from another, and you know, that kind of mad scrapbook mentality is like, it's amazing, and it's what leads to the crazy kind of beautiful genius scrapbook sonics of a lot of his work.
Out of all of the stuff that Frank has done, what is it about Bad Religion that kind of sticks out with you?
I don't know. I mean, it's impossible to pick a Frank Ocean song that is up there. Obviously, he's a genius, and I like Blonde soundtrack the last like few years of my life. I think there's something about that, a bit like it makes me feel like Bad Religion makes me feel the same way as the Anthony Johnson's record. There's like an honesty to it. His ability to create a narrative and insert you into a situation visually, like Bad Religion, like Taxi Driver, like he's sitting in the back of the car, like having this confession with this. It's just beautiful. Like melodically, it's unbelievable. The strings are so stunning. The beat is great, and it's rare, and it comes and it goes. You know, I think that really foreshadowed like what he did in Blonde quite a lot for me. But it's also still got this like pop sensibility to it, and it's a real like the vocal is just so. I mean, as with most of his stuff, it's such an impressive vocal. And yeah, and those albums, like they're long and they're sprawling, and it comes and it totally takes you off guard, and it's just beautiful. Like for me, that and Thinking About You kind of really sit as a pair. Artists like Frank Ocean and you know, and so many others, but like someone like him, that's the genius of it, is that there's a mystery to him, but it's so honest. And like for someone who grew up in London and has probably had a very different life to him, to be able to listen to a record like that and feel totally like moved and like it's happening to you, like you can relate to it that much, it's just unbelievable. Like he's just like a one of a kind. I could literally wax lyrical about Frank Ocean for so long, so I probably have to like put a lid on it, otherwise we'll be here all day.
You talked a little bit earlier about sonic palettes, and you know, you look at a band like the XX who are closer to you in age, would just in peers, you know what I mean? Yeah. For me, that first album is such like a visceral snapshot of time and place and context.
Totally.
What was that like in the UK? I mean, talk to me about what the reception was to that there.
It just didn't sound like anything else at all, you know, and it's interesting how it reverberated through the States. And then to see Jamie XX go on, and you know, I think also I would happily throw the word genius around with him as well. Like, you know, he's someone who manages to make like dance music feel so warm and cozy and inviting, whilst also being kind of haunting and dark at the same time. You know, I think he's incredible. But yeah, that first XX album, like and this is meant as a huge compliment, like there's such simplicity to it. The riffs are so simple, and like it sounds like, and I'm not saying this is true, but it sounds like someone who's like maybe not that good at guitar, but it's just got a beautiful sound and it's just like working their way around it. And it's like way to take guitar, bass and some like MPC drums and make it sound like something that's never been heard before with their voices, and it's so kind of like low key but also epic at the same time. I don't know, it was just I can only speak to my own experience of it, and I just remember hearing it and being like, wow, what is this? It makes me, it was kind of nostalgic because it was also kind of harking back, I think, a bit to sort of like the 90s and stuff. But I think, yes, it's referential, but it also felt so individual and so unique, and yeah, like that album very much has its palette, but there's so many brilliant, beautiful songs on that record. You know, and opening with an instrumental track to be like, hey, this is what we are. Here's our toolkit. Like, we're just going to open it up for you, and then we're just going to take you through this journey with these beautiful songs. That's such a classic record for me, and it still holds up.
We have, I mean, obviously Bowie, you want to talk about the cinematic approach to making, I mean, you want to talk about somebody whose entire discography and career is almost like completely interwoven with the art of cinema.
Yeah.
And I know picking a single Bowie song is like asking which of your fingers you want to cut off first. But talk to me about why Space Oddity has kind of made the cut for you.
Oh, it's just amazing. It's just an amazing song. It's impossible to pick, isn't it? But just the narratives he spins is like literally the scale of thinking that big with pop music. Because there's something, you know, I think with any music you listen to, it's about like how people can relate to it and what it makes you feel and whatever. And to weave these tales of the literally intergalactic tales and well, not intergalactic, but like space. I don't know. It's just amazing to do that with such like, it's bold and courageous and just a fucking massive song. It's how pioneering his Saturday Night Live performances were, for example, in terms of like doing a televised piece of like performance art with like mad wardrobe, and to see its knock-on effect, and now how people take that space and that, you know, that kind of primetime slot to do something that's not only just them playing their song, but like an art statement. That was the thing with Bowie. Like, yes, he also existed in that world. Yes, he made and recorded albums and released them like other people. Albums had artwork, albums had videos, but it was just like on another level of creativity.
Dan, thank you so much. This has been great, man.
Oh, thank you.
This has been I could do this for another 2 hours. Dude, thank you so much for coming through, and thanks for walking us through it.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, man.